When we hear about the Great Flood, we often picture it as an outpouring of divine wrath, a severe punishment for human sin. But have you ever asked yourself, what exactly was that sin? Was it murder, adultery, betrayal of God? If it were only those, why would it require the total annihilation of humanity, both old and young, both the wicked and those who hadn't yet made a choice? What would make God not only judge individuals, but reset the entire order of existence? The truth may go deeper. Perhaps sin was not just a moral failing, it was a total dissonance, a system out of alignment, from time to bloodline to the very essence of the soul. The watchers, angels sent to observe, chose instead to reproduce with earthly women. They brought forth the Nephilim, hybrids between heaven and earth, beings of supernatural strength and also the root of chaos. The Nephilim did not only dominate physically, they distorted the sacred bloodline. But don't stop there. The Nephilim were not the cause, they were the result of a chain of dissonance that began with a seemingly minor yet profoundly crucial detail: the calendar. Imagine a symphony of sacred music being played. If even one instrument falls out of rhythm, the entire harmony falters. Sacred time in the Bible isn't just about days and months. It's a divine structure where every ritual, covenant, and promise must unfold at its appointed moment. According to the Book of Jubilees, humanity lost the 364-day sacred calendar, falling into the offbeat cycles of pagan nations with their 360 or 365-day years. Sacrifices were then made at the wrong times. Festivals fell out of season, blood and prayers no longer met their appointed hour, and divine order began to collapse from the unnoticed corners. It's in that void the Book of Jubilees speaks, a text excluded from Scripture, yet carrying an explanation never before told. That the Great Flood was not merely punishment, but an act to rescue the sacred cycle. A deliberate restart. And if that's true, then the real question is no longer who was guilty, but rather who is still keeping the rhythm, who is living within the covenant's appointed time, and who, today, is reshaping the human bloodline in this very century. There was once a book passed down amid thunder and cloud atop Mount Sinai. A book that does not speak of serpents or hell, nor promise miracles. It speaks only of one thing: how to stay in rhythm with God, not through emotion, not through power, but through time. That book is called Jubilees. It does not declare revelations as fiery as Enoch, nor is it filled with violent images of fallen angels or Nephilim giants. And for that reason, it was overlooked. The Book of Jubilees is the softest whisper, but it holds the most sacred structure. It defines time. When Moses went up Sinai, he received more than the 10 Commandments. He heard all of history, from creation onward, but through a different lens. Every event, every promise, every trial, placed precisely within the 364-day cycle, aligned with 7-year periods, 49-year jubilees, and the sacred cycles ordained by God before Israel ever existed. This holy calendar is not merely a way to count days, it is the heartbeat of the covenant between heaven and earth. Fall out of rhythm, and the promise slips into a void. So why was this book removed? Why is Jubilees absent from the mainstream scriptures, from Judaism to Catholicism and Protestantism alike? Because it is too quiet. It does not serve power. It is not easy to wield as a religious symbol. It cannot be explained in a few simple lines, and that makes it sacred. It does not paint vivid images to remember. It preserves cycles that must not be forgotten. A part of the story has been cut away. We learn about creation, but not about sacred rhythm. We know the flood, but not why the timing of mankind had to be reset. And without the Book of Jubilees, we may still be living out of sync, even while reading Scripture. On the windswept peak of Sinai, a whisper once echoed, "Record all things by year, by month, by day." But that voice is no longer read aloud in churches. It lingers only for those still and quiet enough to hear. And perhaps you are one of them. The Book of Jubilees was once read, once copied, once revered. Not on the fringes of culture, but at the heart of the earliest communities who guarded the Scriptures. It was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, among sacred leather scrolls protected by the Essenes as a living heritage. It survives in full within the Ethiopian tradition, where Christianity took root in the 4th century, but carried the soul of a faith older than Rome. So what happened? Who hid it? And why? The answer lies not only in time, but in power. Jubilees was not easily accepted by Western church councils because it challenged a foundation that post-New Testament theology worked hard to build. The idea that the new law replaced the old. But Jubilees does not teach replacement. It proclaims continuity, that the laws, Sabbaths, and sacrifices existed long before Sinai, that Adam, Seth, Noah, and Abraham lived within a covenant shaped from the dawn of creation. And that view makes the idea that grace began with Jesus feel incomplete to contemporary theologians. No one wants to face the truth that something sacred could exist without religious institutions. If a law was given before the Jews, before the Mosaic law, then the centrality of a people, a temple, a priesthood becomes secondary. And if there is a sacred cycle, independent of human calendars, then the power to decide holy days no longer belongs to the church. That is inconvenient, and inconvenient things are often cast aside. This is not merely a rejection of an idea, it is the erasure of a part of memory, a sacred memory pushed into shadow, not because it was false, but because it did not serve the growing system. When evangelization became a strategy of expansion, when the law was boxed in as a burden, then the Book of Jubilees, with its affirmation of a covenant from Eden, became too dangerous to spread. And so, from church councils to popular translations, that book gradually disappeared. But memory does not die. Those pages still exist, in the ancient Ge'ez language, in the caves of Qumran, and in the hearts of those who sense that something has been left untold. You may not need to know who hid it if you are brave enough to open it again. But if you want to understand why, then ask yourself, who stands to gain if you never read it? We were raised with Genesis, a story we know almost by heart. Adam, Eve, the serpent, the forbidden fruit, and the first death. But have you ever paused to ask, what happened after they left the garden, or before they fell? In Genesis, those details are faint, like preludes to a coming tragedy. But in the Book of Jubilees, every gap is named, every detail is rhythmic, and every parable becomes living history. Adam and Eve were not cast out of Eden immediately. They lived 7 years in the light, taught and preserved within the holy cycle. They learned how to sacrifice, how to rest on the seventh day, how to discern clean from unclean. Eden, according to Jubilees, was not just a garden, but the starting point of a covenant. The laws were given not at Sinai, but in the dawn's first light, and that changes everything. Satan, in the book of Genesis, is a serpent, a vague symbol, a voice from the shadows. But in the book of Jubilees, he has a name, Mastema, not merely a tempter, but the leader of those who oppose the divine order. He does not appear just once, but acts continually across generations, even in the days of Noah. And once you can name the darkness, you begin to realize the battle was never just between man and temptation. It's a war between order and chaos, between sacred rhythm and disrupted time. From the days of Adam, sacrifice was present. Abel did not invent the ritual. He followed a pre-existing model. Noah, in the Book of Jubilees, built the altar on the appointed day, in the appointed way. Abraham observed the Sabbath, kept purity laws, and followed traditions long before the nation of Israel ever came to be. So then, the law did not originate with Moses. The law is something remembered, and those who keep the law are those who still remember the sacred rhythm of Eden. Genesis is the overture, a background score to a grand drama. But Jubilees is the full orchestration, revealing every layer, every beat, every lyric once sung from the beginning. If you only read Genesis, you know the story. But if you also read Jubilees, you begin to see the structure. And once you see the structure, you understand why chaos arose, not merely because of sin, but because the rhythm was broken. And this is most important. If the law existed before Sinai, if the path of light was already laid, if Satan had already been named, then you are not walking in a random story. You are living within a map that was drawn long ago. The question is, do you still remember the way? We often assume that the law began when Moses received the tablets on Mount Sinai. But what if that was never the case? What if the covenant was not something initiated, but something remembered? The Book of Jubilees reveals a shocking truth. The divine law did not wait for Sinai. It had already been alive, quietly, steadily, preserved by the patriarchs through a theological undercurrent stretching all the way from Eden. Adam was not just the first man. He built an altar and made offerings according to the precise instructions of God. Seth, his son, continued the tradition, observing festivals and sacred cycles. Enoch, Adam's grandson, began to record the appointed times and sacred seasons. Enoch, the patriarch who was taken up into heaven, was not only a man who pleased God, but one who kept the calendar, kept the books, and lived in harmony with the covenant's rhythm. Each generation did not merely believe, they safeguarded a sacred system that had never been certified on stone tablets, but had long been etched into human history. Then came Noah, a man living in the age of chaos, but instead of merely being righteous, he lived on time. When the ark came to rest, his first act was not to explore the land, but to build an altar and offer sacrifices at the appointed hour. He taught his sons to keep the Sabbath. He distinguished between clean and unclean animals according to a law never written down but always known. And because of that, he was chosen. Abraham, known to many as the father of faith, is portrayed in Jubilees as a man who kept all commandments, statutes, and ordinances. He rested on the seventh day, established laws for his family, and passed on the sacred instructions concerning marriage, offerings, dietary practices, and spiritual living. He did not follow the law out of compulsion, but out of remembrance. He remembered what had been given in Eden, not at Sinai. Jubilees turns the religious order upside down, not by erasing what Moses received, but by showing that the covenant was never confined to one point in time. It has always existed, wherever someone keeps the sacred cycle. The law did not begin at Sinai. Sinai was simply the moment it was engraved in stone. But before that, it had been inscribed in blood, in calendars, in rituals, and in the memory of our ancestors. We often think of time as a stream, ever flowing forward like an arrow that never looks back. But in the Book of Jubilees, time does not flow. It revolves. It moves in circles. 364 days, divided into seasons, weeks, and festivals, like steady steps on a staircase from earth to heaven. Nothing is random. No day is meaningless. Every moment is part of a sacred song, where each beat of the universe corresponds to a command given from the beginning. But then, something went wrong. Certain nations began to alter the calendar. They measured years by the moon, off by several days each cycle. And from those few days, distortion spread. Sacrifices fell on the wrong dates. Festivals were held in the wrong seasons. The rituals that connected heaven and earth were disrupted. What seemed small shattered the entire sacred map. Jubilees records the warning of the angel Uriel. When you no longer keep the correct calendar, the rituals will become meaningless. The covenant will be forgotten, and mankind will go astray. And so it happened. People continued to offer sacrifices, but on the wrong days. They celebrated feasts, but out of season. They continued religious life, but out of rhythm. And beneath the surface of their piety, sacred reality had died within, before the watchers fell. Before the Nephilim ruled the earth, before humanity was called wicked, there had been a small misalignment, but one significant enough to break the connection between human time and God's time. And when the circle no longer closed, everything began to collapse. That is what Jubilees tries to remind us, that the sacred does not lie only in morality, but in rhythm, and when time no longer turns correctly, every covenant loses its resonance. Therefore, the Great Flood was not merely punishment for sin, it was an alarm that time had lost its beat, and the world needed to be reset from the first circle. They were not sinful beings from the start. They were chosen, assigned the task of guarding humanity. The angels, known as the Watchers, according to Enoch and Jubilees, were sent by God to observe, assist, and uphold moral order among Adam's descendants. They carried the light of heaven and were meant to watch from afar, like sentinels on the walls of a sacred city. But they, the very gatekeepers, opened the door for darkness to enter. No one expected the fall to come from such a height. According to Jubilees, the Watchers were drawn by the beauty of human women. But this was not mere lust. This was the first moment in cosmic history when a heavenly being willingly descended to unite with flesh. They took wives, bore children, but those children were not human. They were Nephilim, massive, violent, and carrying fractured souls torn between heaven and earth. But it didn't stop there. The Watchers taught humanity things they were never meant to know. how to forge weapons, how to use cosmetics to seduce, how to craft enchantments, astrology, and to break the boundary between the seen and unseen. They turned heavenly knowledge into tools of lust and domination. They did not merely fall, they seized the role of creator, and from that moment, not only did mankind lose the covenant, but heaven itself was drawn into a war of chaos. The upheaval struck not only the earth, but pierced through the heavens. The order of Eden, where everything held sacred place, was shattered. And most terrifying of all, those entrusted to uphold the order were the first to betray it. In the eyes of man, they were gods. But in the eyes of God, they were sentries who had abandoned their posts. And when the watchmen abandon the gates, the enemy doesn't need to storm in. The gate was opened from within, and the Nephilim are the living testimony of a sacred order betrayed. We often think of sin as action, murder, violence, idolatry, but Jubilees unveils a deeper layer, that there are things which corrupt an entire bloodline, not by immorality, but by the breakdown of the soul's very structure. Nephilim were not just giants, strong and bloodthirsty. They were the result of a forbidden union between watchers, angels, and humans, a hybridization that was never meant to occur. And when the bloodline was no longer pure, the covenant had no pathway to the next generation. In Jubilees, the true horror is not just violence, but when humanity's bloodstream becomes mixed. God created humans in His image, not just in form, but in biological and spiritual order. When Watchers bore children with mankind, it did not simply violate moral code, it corrupted the very code of the divine plan. A world infected with foreign genes is a world no longer capable of carrying forward the covenant. The order of fathers passing to sons was not just culture, it was the foundation by which the Holy Covenant was preserved. Abraham teaching Isaac, Isaac passing it to Jacob. But when the Nephilim appeared, their offspring no longer belonged to that sacred line. They could not receive the law, they could not understand it, and they could not keep it, because their souls no longer reflected the divine pattern. And that is the greatest tragedy, not merely that mankind sinned, but that humanity could no longer pass down the sacred. The covenant wasn't forgotten out of laziness, it was broken, because there was no one left pure enough to hold it. In the view of Jubilees, the Great Flood was not simply punishment. It was a cleansing to preserve a remnant who could still hear, keep, and live the rhythm of the covenant. It wasn't that the wicked were cast out, but that those who retained the divine genetic signature were kept, because without them, there would be no hand left in human history to pass on the first light. In a world of chaos, where time had fallen out of sacred rhythm, where rituals occurred on wrong days, where the human bloodline had been diluted and souls lost their resonance, there was one man who still kept the heartbeat of the covenant, Noah. He was not perfect, but he was the last who still remembered the hour, still knew when to offer, still kept the appointed cycles. In Jubilees, Noah is not merely a moral man, he is the one who kept the sacred calendar. He built his altar according to the ancestral pattern. He offered sacrifices at the designated times. He did not invent his way of life, but preserved the cadence handed down from Adam, from Enoch, from those first entrusted with the law. And it was that, more than his virtue, that saved him and his family from the global cleansing. Not because he was holier than all, but because he still heard the rhythm of the covenant, still knew the appointed time. The flood was not a surprise event. In Jubilees, it was foretold, it was scheduled, as the final point in a cycle of distortion. And Noah, because he stood in the right place, at the right hour, in the sacred alignment, became the lifeline for the covenant's continuation. Noah did not keep this to himself. He recorded the law. He divided the sacred land among his 3 sons, according to a preordained order. He warned them of the holy days, the rituals, the markers placed in the sacred calendar. He acted as a father, but with the heart of a priest, preserving the covenant's rhythm, unbroken, even as the world around him sank. When we think of Noah, we often picture the ark, but Jubilees reveals he was the last working clock. While all humanity spun in distorted cycles, Noah still lived by the days appointed from the beginning. And that fidelity, not abstract morality, is what made him the bridge between the old world and the new. A living witness that whoever still keeps the rhythm, the covenant still has somewhere to go. There was a period Scripture calls before the flood, but in Jubilees it is portrayed not merely as a time of moral crisis, but a chilling spiritual silence. Angels no longer appeared. The heavenly messengers, the watchers once sent to guard mankind, were now imprisoned or banished. Those who once gave warnings no longer spoke. There were no prophets, no voice from heaven. The covenant that once echoed from Eden to Abraham had grown silent, not because God stopped speaking, but because no one remained tuned to hear. Time still moved, but no one knew what day it was in the sacred calendar. No one remembered which Sabbath was real. People still offered sacrifices, but on the wrong days. They built altars, but in the wrong shape. They celebrated Passover at a time no longer meaningful. Every act of worship became a performance, a vague memory disconnected from the divine intention. This was no longer personal error, but the dissonance of an entire civilization. Every sacred act, instead of linking heaven and earth, now jammed the frequency. Prayers offered at the wrong hour were unheard. Sacrifices made off-season had no echo. The angels, once the clocks between heaven and earth, have withdrawn, not out of anger, but because the rhythm had become so misaligned that no signal could pass through. In the Book of Jubilees, this is the most terrifying sacred silence. There was no fire from heaven, no cloud covering the sanctuary, no voice in dreams. A civilization was still alive, but severed from its divine pulse. It was not merely a loss of moral direction, but the collapse of the spiritual spine, the axis by which humans knew their place in the light of God. And that is why the Great Flood was not just a punishment, but a re-establishment, to reconnect a severed link, to cleanse the sacred frequencies from static, and to ask one final question. While the angels are silent, who among humankind is still awake enough to hear the sacred rhythm? Who still knows what day today is in God's calendar? And if no one remembers anymore, how much time is left before the sacred clock must be reset by water? When we think of sin, we often imagine disobedience, a wrong action, a personal choice that strays from the law. But in Jubilees, the concept of sin goes much deeper. Sin is not merely what you do, it is what you do out of sync with an invisible order established from the beginning of creation. It is when a small act, a wrong day, a mistimed ritual causes a fracture in the entire coordination between heaven, earth, and humanity. That order operates on a sacred rhythm. A 364-day calendar, 7 Sabbaths, 14 generations, a divine clock engraved by God into the universe. And when mankind began using distorted calendars, 365-day years, lunar months, they weren't merely mathematically off. They lost connection with God's time. This misalignment didn't only affect ceremonies, it severed the bond between soul and origin. A sacrifice on the wrong day no longer opened the door of covenant. A prayer in an off cycle no longer echoed in heaven. The bloodline of generations, once transmitted in right timing, became blended with the strange and the sacred. And sin, in this context, was no longer a matter of personal moral failure. It was the collapse of a cosmic symphony, one misplayed note that disrupted the entire sacred song. That is why the Great Flood was not just an outburst of wrath, but an act of restructuring. God did not destroy humanity merely for being wicked, but for living out of sync. And if that had continued, the whole planet would have spun off its sacred axis. In Jubilees, we do not just see a world fallen into moral decay, we see a universe out of phase. And God, like a conductor, had to retune the strings, even if that meant silencing everything, just to hear again the first beat of the sacred covenant. Nephilim, in modern imagination, are often seen as mighty giants, supernatural warriors, half god, half human. But in Jubilees, their existence is not just a physical anomaly, it is a deep theological warning. Once the bloodline is hybridized, once heaven and earth are forcibly merged outside of God's will, the entire structure of creation descends into chaos. Nephilim are not terrifying because of their size, but because of their essence. They are the clearest sign of a reality that has deviated from its original design. Born from the union of fallen angels and fragile humanity, a fusion that was never meant to exist, Jubilees warns, when the blood is no longer pure, there is no way to offer sacrifice in proper form. No one remains qualified to make an offering. No community can keep the law in its fullness. Nephilim are not just a sign of moral decay. They are the evidence of a distorted cosmic architecture. They are the final symptom, the surface crack of a system that has rotted from within. A world may still function, but no longer heal itself. Like a warped instrument, no matter how well it's played, the sound it produces is off-key. And so, in his redemptive plan, God could not simply forgive the presence of the Nephilim. He had to remake the foundation. The Great Flood, from the lens of Jubilees, is no longer an emotional outburst, but a restoration of the sacred operating system. Once these hybrid beings entered the bloodstream of humanity, the covenant could not be upheld through the old means. Nephilim are a warning. Some deviations cannot be corrected. They must be remade. And that is why water was poured out, not to kill, but to cleanse, not to punish, but to recreate what was once right. When we think of Noah, most of us remember him as a righteous man in a wicked generation, a model of personal virtue amid a moral flood. But what if God's choice was not based merely on ethics, but on something deeper, a sacred rhythm that only one man still kept? According to Jubilees, Noah was not just good, he lived in rhythm. He knew precisely the 364-day cycle God had set from the beginning. He offered sacrifices on the correct days, rested on the right Sabbaths, and passed down what the patriarchs had preserved, not through writing, but through the rhythm of life. Noah was one who could still receive the signal of the sacred clock, when the rest of the world had lost frequency. In a universe breaking apart, where time was distorted, bloodlines blended, laws forgotten, Noah was the last remaining link between heaven and earth. He was not merely a spared victim, but a preserved marker to re-establish order. Like a clean copy of a system backup, he was kept in a living archive, the Ark, so that after the reconstruction, the program of the covenant could reboot. Noah's selection wasn't just mercy, it was precision preservation. And because he lived in rhythm, everything around him realigned. Animals entered the ark in pairs, exactly in creation order. Sacrifices were offered after landfall at the proper ancestral feast time. Even the rainbow, the sign of the new covenant, appeared at the exact moment God re-established his promise. Nothing was random, everything was resynchronized, because one man, one single man, still lived by heaven's clock. Noah didn't just survive, he preserved the time of the covenant, and for that, history was permitted to begin again. When we think of the angels in Scripture, we often recall Michael, the warrior Gabriel, the messenger Raphael, the healer. But there is one angel rarely mentioned, who plays a silent yet crucial role in the structure of the sacred universe, Uriel. He carries no sword, no thunder, but something far stronger, a calendar. In the Book of Jubilees, he is entrusted to deliver to Enoch, and later to Moses, the 364-day cycle, a measurement of time, not of man, but of God. When rituals, feasts, and sacrificial seasons fall out of sync, it is Uriel who appears, not to punish, but to restore the precision of the universe. Uriel is not the angel of information. He is the guardian of the covenant clock. In the chaos before the flood, when no one knew which day was holy, which season held the offerings, or which moon was out of alignment, Uriel returned as the only accurate heartbeat in the silence of the sacred. He reasserted the 364-day cycle as an unbroken circle, divided into quarters, festivals, and appointed times so the covenant would not be lost. Not everyone heard that call, but those who kept the covenant, like Noah, heard it, and through them history was preserved. The strange thing is, God did not send fire to burn away the first deviations. He did not wield a sword to instantly sever the corrupted bloodline. He sent Uriel, the one who adjusts the clock. This reveals something profound. To live in right time is not a habit, but a divine nature. A person may be weak, may fail, but if they live in rhythm with the covenant, they still hold the thread connecting them to heaven. Uriel is not a vague symbol. He is the reminder. Time is sacred, and to live on time is a holy act, silently resisting the chaos of the world. In Uriel's return was the last chance for the world to return to its axis, and each of us, if we still hear the sacred time, may be keeping a portion of the covenant that many generations have forgotten. When we hear the Great Flood, our minds default to wrath, a punishment on all humanity for sin. But Jubilees reveals a different view, even an opposite one. It was a sacred rite, a redemptive act of recreation, not to destroy out of hate, but to preserve what was on the verge of extinction, the covenant. When time was misaligned, the bloodline corrupted, the sacred law forgotten, and rituals performed out of season, the entire structure of the universe no longer reflected the divine will. In such a world, every sacred act became meaningless, and every sacrifice ineffective. That was when the water came, not like a sword falling, but like a stream washing the dust from a blurred covenant tablet. The Great Flood was not a moment of rage. It was a cosmic baptism, a divine cleansing of an ecosystem contaminated by deviation. In Jubilees, Noah did not merely survive. He passed through a rite, a purification, not just of body, but of time itself. When he stepped onto dry land, it was not the restored old world. It was a new era, where the covenant was re-signed with a rainbow and time was restarted on rhythm. Only those who still lived in rhythm, like Noah, were carried to the other side of the water, not because they were perfect, but because they still held the sacred clock calling for alignment with heaven. The flood became a doorway, not out of life, but into a new life, one that matched the original design. The story of the flood, through the lens of Jubilees, is no longer a tragedy, but a divine festival of beginnings, a rite so profound that only those still on time could perceive its sacred nature. And that is why the water did not merely kill, it rescued the covenant. A calendar, to many today, is just a tool for scheduling work, setting appointments, or counting down to holidays. But to the Book of Jubilees, the calendar is not a grid of numbers. It is the deepest divine structure of the covenant. The 364-day cycle was established by God from the beginning, not merely to measure time, but to synchronize mankind with heaven. Each day, each week, each month is not merely administrative, but a sacred heartbeat where every ritual, offering, and act of worship must occur on time, without a beat missed. But then humanity lost it. As mankind shifted toward distorted calendar systems, blending lunar and solar cycles, what seemed convenient became deviation. Sacrifices were performed on the wrong days. Sabbaths shifted, holy markers blurred, and worse, people kept doing religious acts, but offbeat, like playing a sacred song out of rhythm. In Jubilees, abandoning the 364-day calendar was not just a technical error, it was the breakdown of the covenant at its root. Because the covenant is not just promises, it is a system that runs on divine timing. The Great Flood, in that light, is a grave warning. It is not merely the end of moral failure, but the collapse of an entire time cycle. And after the flood, the first thing Noah did was not build a house, but erect an altar on the correct day, restore the calendar, and rebuild the covenant through primal rhythm. This shows living in sacred time is not a burdensome ritual. It is the condition for life to continue on the right path. And tragically, that 364-day calendar has nearly vanished from the world's memory. We are now living in a time system created by man and calling it standard. We worship, celebrate, and offer on human calendars, yet we expect divine resonance from God. Could it be that we are playing a song out of rhythm and don't even know it? The sacred calendar, according to Jubilees, is not some ancient relic. It is the cosmic clock. And if we do not realign time, we may be losing an entire covenant without realizing it. When the flood subsided, when all the cries had fallen silent, when the earth still lay cold and damp with the tears of humanity, Noah, the last man to keep the rhythm, stepped off the ark. He did not build a house. He did not establish a city. He did not search for food. The first thing Noah did was build an altar. This was not a gesture of emotion, nor a fleeting moment of gratitude. According to the Book of Jubilees, it was a ritual preserved in the tradition of the patriarchs, handed down from Adam, Abel, and Enoch. Noah, as the keeper of memory, restored the rite on the appointed day, chose the clean animals, and offered sacrifice in the correct order, not a beat missed, not a season delayed. Because he knew, if the covenant was not restored, survival meant nothing. In that moment, the covenant was renewed, not through a voice from the heavens, not by a contract inscribed on stone, but through worship done on time, in the right form, according to the divine law, amid a world that had just been cleansed. Life was not merely resumed biologically, it was re-established spiritually. Noah's altar was not the first in history, but it was the first after an age of broken rhythms, after a time when the covenant had been forgotten, disordered, and distorted by strange metaphysical forces. And at that altar, a sweet aroma rose, as Scripture says, that moved God. It was a ritual not meant to appease, but to reopen the dialogue. Noah was not merely a survivor. He was the one who reconnected heaven and earth. In Jubilees, he is portrayed as a priest, not one who needed ordination, for his life of faithful rhythm was itself a sacred testimony. His action caused the angels to record a new cycle, as if the universe had just been reconfigured by loyalty. From that point, human history was written not only by what people did, but whether they still lived in rhythm with the sacred. Noah's altar, at its core, was humanity's first response to a covenant just rescued from the flood. A response not spoken, but timed. As the waters withdrew and the sky turned blue again, Noah's family were not merely the last humans alive. They were the remnants of a sacred structure once fractured. To the world, they were a father, mother, 3 sons, and 3 daughters-in-law. But in the lens of Jubilees, they were a sacred archive of the entire memory of the covenant, the law, the calendar, the bloodline, and the divine order from Eden. Each member carried not just biological genes, but sacred ones. They were the fragile bridge between a world just cleansed and one about to begin anew. Noah, the rhythm keeper, passed it on to his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But Jubilees is clear. Not all 3 preserved the spirit of the covenant. Though all were saved, only the line of Shem remained pure, chosen by God to continue the lineage of those who kept the law. Shem was the one who remembered rightly, the one who extended the sacred line and later became the forefather of Abraham. Ham, though father of many, soon fell out of rhythm. Japheth, though populous, was not set as the covenant's central axis. This reveals a key truth. Survival does not equal selection. Being spared does not equal being entrusted. What God seeks is not merely those who escape judgment, but those who continue living rightly. And that begins with preserving the bloodline, not just biologically, but in its sacred essence, its memory, its law, and its timing. Noah's family, especially Shem, became the foundation of a new era. In that time, there were no cities, no human-made laws, no institutional religion, only one marker to identify God's people, their rhythm, Those who lived according to the 364-day cycle, who offered at the appointed times, who kept clean from unclean, who honored the bloodline and refused to hybridize, those were the ones who held the sacred breath of life. Noah's family did not just restart humanity. They stood as a symbol that true life flows not just from blood, but from faithfulness. And in them, the covenant was planted once again, silently, like a seed waiting for the right season to bloom. When the great flood ended, many assumed it was the closing of an age and the birth of something entirely new. But if we read Jubilees carefully, we realize the covenant was never severed. It simply shifted tempo from one cycle to the next, like one season following another. God did not create a brand new program. He simply preserved the original frequency, even if only through one person, one family, or one rare generation that still lived in rhythm. Noah was not just a survivor, he was a keeper of memory. In Jubilees, he didn't merely offer sacrifice after the flood. He wrote, recorded the laws of the patriarchs, restored the calendar of feasts, and passed on the 364-day cycle to his sons. He didn't build a church. He rebuilt the rhythm of life. To Noah, the covenant was not a wall-mounted document. It was a living cycle, resting on the right day, offering the right sacrifice, distinguishing the sacred from the unclean. And he understood, if this was not preserved, the covenant wouldn't disappear, but it would fall out of sync, and people would live without hearing the voice of God. Jubilees does not tell the story in linear form, but in cycles. 49 years, a jubilee. 7 weeks of years, a new age. Each person who lives in rhythm becomes a covenant reminder, not through speeches nor loud rituals, but through a quiet life lived in accordance with the law. Holiness does not lie in form, but in timely repetition. Like an ancient song, as long as one person remembers the melody, the symphony will one day rise again. And so, the covenant did not end on Mount Ararat. It flowed in Shem's blood. It lived in the records passed down. It hid in the memories of those who still kept the Sabbath day, amid a world confused by time. And it continues to echo, quietly but firmly, in the souls who even today still wonder, what day is it in God's time? If you've ever felt like you're living out of sync, if you've sensed something misaligned in modern life, then perhaps the echo of the covenant is still reaching you. You don't need an ark. You don't need a mountain. All you need is a resolve to preserve what is sacred, as a cycle that never ends. And once you begin to walk in that rhythm, the covenant will not just return to life, it will flow through you, just as it once flowed through Noah. None of us are perfect, and the most beautiful truth in Jubilees is God never demanded perfection. He asks only one thing: do you remember? Remember the sacred rhythm, where time is not merely for productivity, but for connection with the covenant. You don't have to become a perfect lawkeeper overnight. No one can. But you can start with a question that seems simple. What day is it in God's calendar? Not by your watch, not by the Roman calendar, not by your phone app, but by the rhythm set from Eden. If you feel your life is out of rhythm, don't be afraid. It's not a sentence, it's a signal to return. Like an instrument that's fallen out of tune, it isn't thrown away for a few wrong notes. The master patiently retunes it with care and love. So does God does. He does not scold you for drifting. He waits for you to return to the right rhythm. And that rhythm is not invisible. It lives in the Book of Jubilees, in the 364-day cycle, in the Sabbaths, in the seasons of offering, in the lives of those who seem forgotten but are walking in sync with heaven. If you've ever felt like you're drifting, like life has no direction, like your prayers don't echo, like good deeds feel empty, the issue may not be faith, but rhythm. Maybe you're using the wrong clock to measure sacred time. And Jubilees doesn't come to condemn, it comes to offer a map, a way back, a way for you, even in imperfection, to become a keeper of the covenant, simply because you remember. Remember that there was once another rhythm, a sacred cycle, still waiting for someone to step into it. You don't need to be perfect, you only need to remember. You may have never preached, never stood on a pulpit, never written a book, never taught theology, never founded a community. Maybe you live quietly, holding the Sabbath in your heart, eating in ways that honor clean from unclean, feeling something off when the world celebrates on the wrong day. Maybe you've thought, I'm just an ordinary person. Does what I keep really matter? But Jubilees offers a surprising answer. Yes, the covenant has never been preserved by the majority. It's been kept by the seemingly unknown. Those who never let go of sacred rhythm, even if no one noticed them. Not every generation has an Enoch. Not every era has a Moses. But there are always a few who live rightly, and they are the reason the covenant has never truly died. Jubilees says that God records every accurate cycle, every ritual kept on time, and He remembers each person. You are not forgotten, you are not invisible. You are living proof that God's plan has not failed, that a faithful undercurrent still flows through history, through all the chaos, through every culture now out of sync. And if you are still living this way, quietly, steadily, without letting go, then you are extending an ancient covenant. You are the remaining spark of light, small, but enough to keep the map of the covenant from being erased. Don't wait for applause. Don't wait for the crowd to return. If you still keep the rhythm, the covenant still lives. Because true light does not need a crowd. It only needs one person who still believes the dawn is worth waiting for. You don't have to be a prophet. You don't have to change the world. Sometimes a small act done on time is enough to shake the sacred around you. Tomorrow, try resting on the Sabbath, not out of law, but out of love for the original breath. Or simply open a calendar and mark a 49-day cycle as a quiet reminder that you still remember how to measure God's time. Or even just whisper to yourself, today is the day light was created. You are restoring a forgotten clock, not on your wrist, but in your soul. And perhaps your quiet act is the beginning of a new cycle, a flow that will reconnect the sacred heartbeat, not only for you, but for your family, for a lost community, for an age that has forgotten how to hear the covenant's call. Begin with one small step, but taken on time. You're not just returning, you are reopening history. If you've stayed with this story to the final moment, this is no longer just a video. It is a silent call within your heart. Don't let it pass as just another piece of content. Leave a comment. Not just to say thank you, but to record a memory, a sacred beat in your heart that has just awakened. It may be a detail that made you pause, a question that stirred your thoughts, or a feeling that reminded you you're not alone in the journey to rediscover the covenant. You don't have to preach, just tell. A time you lived rightly, but no one saw. A moment you kept a small command that the world found unnecessary. Or even the opposite, a time you fell out of rhythm, lost the right timing, and now long to find it again. These quiet testimonies are how we reconnect the broken thread, how we revive the memory the world has forgotten. Write it so the memory isn't lost again. Share it so others know they are not alone. And maybe, from your small word, a cycle will begin again, not through argument, but through the echo of soul to soul. Amen.